What we were seeing, well, first, I'm going to analyze two patterns that are rather complex patterns that are Seljuk. They're Seljuk and lovely examples of Seljuk pattern making. I'm going to look at them from the point of view of constructing the patterns because the methodology that's used can be used for an infinite number of patterns. And so this is a good example of another category of pattern making that takes sometimes unlikely combinations of patterns and puts them together, unlikely combinations of star forms and puts them together into one pattern. And this kind of pattern I define as, or categorize as a non-systematic. When Jean-Marc was just speaking, he was showing you several patterns and pattern developments based on a fivefold system of independent elements that can be rearranged in any number, actually an infinite number of ways. And so it has tremendous diversity and capability of making new designs, but they all have the same basic feel to them because they're made from the same elements. And so this is a system, it's a design system. Whether you go about it by making the patterns, by assembling the pattern elements or assembling the underlying polygonal elements, one way or another, it's a system. And I have identified 5 different systems that were used historically in Islamic architecture, or ornament, geometric ornament. One uses 6-fold, 3-fold, and 4-fold symmetry within the same system, interestingly, but it's made from just the regular polygons. So that's the triangle and the square, the hexagon and the dodecagon. The octagon can also be considered. That's one system. Then there's 2 systems have 4-fold symmetry. I'm not going to go into the systems. I'm going to be talking about non-systematic, but just to give a little bit of background. Then there are 2 4-fold systems. There's a 5-fold system that Jean-Marc was just showing us. And there's actually a 7-fold system that Marek earlier referred to. The 7-fold system is more obscure. It's not generally, you don't see many examples of it. There's one here in Istanbul that I actually discovered, but there's less than a dozen, I think less than 12 in all of the Islamic world that I know of. So those are systematic patterns, but I'm going to be talking right now about non-systematic patterns. And what differentiates the difference between the two is that the underlying elements in the polygonal elements that create the patterns of systematic pattern making can be rearranged in an infinite number of ways. And that's why it's systematic. In the non-systematic method, the underlying elements cannot rearrange. They're specific to the one pattern. They're not, it doesn't have the ability to make lots and lots of patterns. It makes one pattern. So before I go to that, though, let me talk about the polygonal technique. Jean-Marc was referring to it not by the terminology I'm using, polygonal technique, but the basic idea is that there's an underlying structure, a polygonal tessellation, that is a generative system, or generative structure, upon which lines can be placed, and those lines then create a pattern, and the pattern is dispensed with later on. I'm sorry, the polygonal network is dispensed with later on, leaving just the pattern. And there are multiple sources for the historicity of this technique. The most important is the Topkapi scroll. I had the good fortune early in my career doing geometric work in 1986. I visited Istanbul on business, and I, just as a tourist, went to the Topkapi Museum, and they had the scroll on display. And I had already been making patterns with polygonal networks, and I saw the scroll and I was amazed because the very same network of polygons was shown as the generative methodology in this scroll. So before that I had no idea if this was something that was used traditionally or not. It was an important thing for me. So this is on the left side are 2 examples from the Topkapi scroll that you can see. The center panel is a pattern that, that makes 12-pointed stars and 10-pointed stars in one combination. And the underlying network of pentagons, if you can see them in red, those pentagons, much like Jean-Marc's pentagons, they show a relationship to the pattern. But unlike the examples that Jean-Marc showed, these you cannot rearrange into other examples. The proportions of the pentagons are not true pentagons in the sense that they don't have equal sides and equal angles at in each corner of the pentagon. They're a little bit out of line to take into account the 12 and 10-pointed stars. So they're a very specific modification allowing for, yes, a 5-pointed star, but it's not an even perfect 5-pointed star, but it looks to the eye very nice. So this is a non-systematic example of a underlying polygonal tessellation or generative tessellation, making a very nice pattern. This example on the right-hand side is from the same document that Marek showed us earlier, that is an addendum to Bouzjani's work, and it shows a polygonal network for making a pattern with a 7-fold symmetry. It's rather interesting. Then another piece of evidence I found for the polygonal technique comes from a frontispiece for a Quran that is at the British Museum. It's on display to the public. At first glance, you just look at it and think there's a beautiful pattern with 10-pointed stars, you know, really lovely. But if you see it, as I was fortunate to see it, at an oblique angle of light, with a light source that's raking across it at an oblique angle, the little indentations in the paper that are otherwise invisible to the eye become apparent, and the indentations in question make this pattern in green. And once again, it's this polygonal net. Clearly, the artist used a steel scribe, a steel stylus, a point of a steel stylus, and embedded lines into the paper before painting, and used those lines as a guide to paint the pattern. And then there are some architectural pieces of evidence as well. The most important, you might say, is this piece on the left. This is from the Sultan Hassan Madrasah and Mosque in Cairo. The reason I think it's most important is because it's from a really quite early date. It's 1363, which predates the Topkapi scroll by some 200 years or even more, which means that this polygonal methodology goes back even farther than the Topkapi scroll. And later than the Topkapi scroll, there are several examples from India, from these jolly pierced marble and pierced sandstone screens from India. There are a few of these that show the polygonal network along with the pattern, and that's another indication of the use of these. So right now I'm showing you 4 patterns because I want to talk about pattern families. So you can categorize patterns as systematic and non-systematic. You can also categorize patterns from one system or another. So in other words, the system of the 5 systems, rather than just systematic, there are actually 5 systems. So you can identify this system or that system. These 4 patterns are made from the Fivefold System. But within any system or within any underlying generative tessellation, you can extract more than one pattern. You can make more than one pattern from any one polygonal network. And this is showing 4 different patterns. I've identified 4 families of patterns that are again and again used throughout Islamic patterns across all of the Islamic world. And they're identified they're differentiated by the angle of the lines that cross the polygonal edges. So the one on the upper left is an acute pattern. The crossing pattern lines are more acute. The one to the right of that, on the upper right, the angles are wider. This was like the examples Jean-Marc was showing us. They have 72. The one on the left, the acute, is 36-degree contact angles. The one to the right of that in the upper right, 72-degree crossing pattern lines. The one on the lower left is 108. It's more obtuse, so I call it the obtuse family. Actually, these acute and obtuse both are used to describe this family of pattern, these two families of patterns in Iran, but I don't know of the name for the one on the upper right or on the lower right. And the lower right uses 2 points along each underlying polygonal edge, so I call it 2-point patterns. But these 4 types of patterns they occur so frequently once this became a mature tradition in the 13th century and even in the late 12th century. By that period of time, the geometric patterns had become so codified or so regularized that almost all examples of patterns are one or another of these 4 systems. So these are 4 families: acute, median, obtuse, and 2-point. The reason I call it median is it's the 72 degrees is halfway between 108 and 36. And by the way, those angles will be different in different systems. So these angles relate to fivefold symmetry directly. 36, like Merrick was saying, you take 360 degrees and divide it by 10 and you get 36. So the 36 is directly related to the decagon. But if you're dealing with the octagon as a formative element, the acute family, instead of 36 degrees, will have 45 degrees, et cetera, et cetera. 7-fold patterns, they will always relate. So it's really, the 36 relates to the 5-fold, but other acute patterns and other families will have other pattern angles, but they'll have a sharp quality to them. The 5-pointed stars will have sharp points. Okay, so here are 4 examples, historical examples of each of those 4 from the previous page. So this previous image, the same pattern in each of these is here, the very same pattern from quite different sources. The upper left is Ghurid, it's really quite early, it's 12th century. The one on the median pattern on the upper right is Timurid, early 15th century. And the lower left, this is Seljuk here from Turkey, and it's 13th century. And the one on the lower right is Mamluk, and it's 15th century. Each of these is made from the same underlying polygonal network as the other. So they look, see how different they look? They look so different. They have to have a different kind of category. The one on the upper right has the stars have sharp points. The one on the upper left has sharp points. The one on the upper right has more open points. The one on the lower left has no points at all. And then the one on the lower right has this overlapping quality that's typical of 2-point patterns. Okay, then I want to speak a little bit before getting into the patterns in question on repeat units. And so, of course, the standard repeat units of the regular grids are the triangle, the square, and the hexagon. And I've shown in green lines the dual. So the dual of the triangular grid is a hexagonal grid, and the dual of the hexagonal grid is a triangular grid, and the dual of the square grid is another square grid. So this is very simple. Underneath, I'm wanting to show that you can take the triangular grid, and if I remove, in the lower left, you see the triangular grid. Next to it, you see a rhombic grid made up of rhombi. That's just a simple rhombi by removing the vertical lines, in this case, the vertical lines. And so I'm making, Jean-Marc was referring to this a little while ago, I'm making a rhombic grid out of a triangular grid. And then if I look at the pattern to the right of the lower part of the slide, this is a particular pattern with 9-pointed stars. It's also Seljuk. It comes from, I've forgotten where, I think Lake Van. Anyway, eastern Anatolia, if I'm not mistaken. And every 9-pointed star is on a vertice of the triangular grid, but the angles are such that it will not repeat as a single element, triangular element. It will only repeat as a rhombus. And because the 9 it gets technical, but I won't go into it because it's not what I'm talking about right now. But the main point of this is to show that rhombic grids, to come back to what you were saying about asking the question about rhombic grids are kind of fundamental components. Not all patterns, but some patterns will only work on a rhombic grid. This is one. This pattern will not work on a triangular grid. It has to work with a rhombic grid, even though it has threefold symmetry. Okay, so, excuse me, here. So now, on the fivefold system, Jean-Marc was talking about the two different rhombi. Forgive me, I'll go over this really quickly because you've just heard and seen a much more demonstrative examples. But on the left side is the rhombic grid of the wide rhombus, what I call a wide rhombus. And on the right is a rhombic grid with the narrow rhombus. But as Jean-Marc was showing, they will work together beautifully in all manner of different ways, infinite number of ways, including aperiodic ways and periodic ways. And these both were used for traditional pattern making by Muslim artists. And you can see quickly, here's a sevenfold. Did I miss a slide there? Yes, I missed a slide. So here you can see the way of a way of generating these two rhombi. Jean-Marc didn't really go into this too much, but if you just take the 10, if you take a circle and divide by 10, and you can see how you can align the radii in such a way to make the rhombus one way, or you can align them another way to make the rhombus another way. It's very simple. The same thing can be said for the 7. So here we have the division of the circle into 14 parts, and we can make the rhombus in 3 ways. And so there are 3 rhombi that are associated with sevenfold symmetry. And each of those can be used to create patterns with sevenfold symmetry, or they can be used, like Jean-Marc was showing, to create patterns that use all 3 of them within one pattern. But I'm not talking about sevenfold patterns right now. It's another subject for elaboration. But here are the 3 grids with sevenfold symmetry, each of which has actually been used, except for the one on the right. I've never found a historical pattern for the one on the right, but the one in the middle and the one on the left has been used for historical examples. Okay, and then another repeat strategy is to repeat with a rectangular grid. So this is a pattern, very well-known pattern, that the red lines show the repeat unit and the green lines show the dual of it. And this is, rectangular repeats will be used a lot historically. And so will hexagonal patterns, hexagonal repeats. And this is a case showing elongated hexagons. So a hexagon to repeat does not have to be a regular hexagon with, threefold symmetry and sixfold symmetry. It can also be elongated to match the proportions of a pattern that requires something other than a conventional regular hexagon. In this case, this is a pattern that has both 11 and 13 pointed stars. This is from Azerbaijan. It's produced during the Seljuk influence during the Eldegizid dynasty of Azerbaijan, closely allied with the Seljuks and culturally familiar with their techniques for making patterns. This is a really complex pattern. One of the things that's interesting about these sorts of patterns with 2 or more regions of localized symmetry, in this case 11-fold and 13-fold, is the way that these patterns function, the way that these elements function together, these otherwise disparate, unlikely combinations, 11 and 13, very unlikely combination. The way that they are allowed or able to work together is by this matrix of connective elements. So the stars are regular. That's a regular 11, it's a regular 13. They're not modified. They're absolute 11-fold symmetry and absolute 13-fold symmetry. But the way they're allowed to function together is by the connective, what I call the pattern matrix, in between the areas of localized symmetry. So in this case, this same pattern can repeat with a hexagonal, elongated hexagon from the 11-fold centers, which is the upper left, the lower right pattern, the more squat hexagon, or it can be made to repeat from the centers of the 13-fold stars, and that's the upper left in the green. So either one, these 2 grids that these 2 hexagons make are duals of each other, and either one can be seen as a repeat unit on its own. This, by the way, exceeds any this is far in advance of any other knowledge of repetitive geometry than other cultures had, as leaps and bounds. This is really very sophisticated geometry that these people made. And this is very old. This is 12th century, late 12th century, or early 13th. It's a very old example. Okay, so now I want to talk about these two patterns from Seljuk, Turkey, and then I want to just show how this same kind of methodology can be used today. So that as a final. So the first one uses 9-pointed stars and 6-pointed stars, and look how simple it is. You can pack together nonagons in a nice, orderly fashion on a hexagonal grid, as you see on the left-hand side. It works very easily, and then you can simply use the midpoints of those nonagonal edges to lay in lines, pattern lines, and you get this beautiful example. This comes from the Aladdin Mosque in Konya, and it's early 13th century. Very simple design. It's non-systematic because the nonagons don't work in any other way. They don't work with other regular elements. But it's kind of semi-systematic because it only uses that one form. The other element on the left-hand side is that 6-pointed star. That is a background element, an interstice. It self-forms itself. It's like Jean-Marc was saying, you can make these patterns with primary elements, and then there are these secondary elements. So that's very much a secondary element. And this is the example itself from the Aladdin Mosque in Konya. It's a beautiful pattern. It's not very complicated, but it's a beautiful pattern nonetheless. So really what I want to, and that's actually the photograph of the pattern. The two triangles on the, not the center one, but the two on either side of it. I'm sorry, it's not, this is a different pattern with nines, and this is the one I want to talk about. So here we are, this is the second pattern with 9-pointed stars on a hexagonal grid. This is a little bit more complex than that last one, as you can tell. Here, let me rush back. Here we have that one, and here we have this one, see? It's a little bit more complex. So this pattern uses it's a convenient way of making this pattern. It would be very difficult to make this pattern using the step-by-step construction technique that most people are teaching pattern making with. It's not going to lend itself easily to that. But it's actually rather simple to make using the technique that has really 3 components to it for making non-systematic patterns. The first is to make a radii matrix. That's like a pattern of radii. The second from the radii matrix is to make a polygonal net or tessellation. And then from that tessellation, you can make the pattern. So to make the radii matrix, in this case, I'm starting simply with hexagonal grid. Then I'm putting, on each vertice, I'm going to put 9 radii. So that's the first vertice. And then I'm also, for ease of design, I'm going to add another 9 radii. Okay, so now there's going to be 18 radii. It makes it. By the way, the use of radii matrices for making patterns is corroborated in the top copy scroll. It's not been identified by anybody as such. I think I'm the first to recognize the significance of it. But the radii are shown. The matrix of radii are shown in the non-systematic patterns in the top copy scroll. So now you have 18 radii. Now if I apply those to each vertice and trim them up, it looks like that. It's actually kind of a good-looking structure just in its own right. Okay, from that, if I just take one hexagon out of that, and I've got my 18 radii at each point, if I extend the lines in and trim them, I have this repetitive element. If you look on the lower left side of the repetitive element, I've drawn a circle. I hope you can see it. I've drawn a circle that is tangent to the 3 sides of that lower triangle. It's a rather simple thing to do. So the reason the 18 radii were placed in there is because that's a convenient way to find the center of where that circle is going to be. So that allows me to then draw a circle and draw two perpendicular lines that intersect with the circle and the radius. And now what that is giving me are those two lines, very easily established. This is a simple geometry. Those two lines then define a pentagon and a nonagon. So you see how that works from there to there? Now I've got a nonagon and I've got a pentagon. And then what I can do is I can do the same process into all 6 vertices of our repetitive hexagon. And I've got a structure going on now, a polygonal structure that's going on. And then the next step is to draw these elements like this. Very easy. And now I have got a polygonal network. I've got a nice, easily made polygonal network, not difficult to make at all. And so I usually sometimes I shorthand these to call them subgrids. Sub because they go underneath the pattern, grids because they're a polygonal grid. But technically I call them an underlying generative tessellation. So with the underlying generative tessellation then, oops, went the wrong way. There, I can now start putting in pattern lines. The pattern lines are, in this case, are acute. They're sharper. I don't have to. I could use more obtuse ones. Each one of these, as I'll repeat, each one of these underlying generative tessellations will create 4 different types of pattern. In this case, the example from the Aladdin Mosque is an acute pattern. So I lay in these crossing pattern lines. Do you notice how they're parallel? The angle is established by keeping the lines parallel to the edge of the repeat unit. Now I put in another set of crossing parallel lines, crossing pattern lines at the midpoints of the pentagons. I extend those around, to finish the 1/6 element, I'm putting these 2 additional lines in. There are a number of ways of treating this stage. It could have been done differently. This particular example does this. Then it's applied to all 6 locations. The lines are just extended in to meet, and that's our finished pattern. And that's how it looks in its just pure line form. And that's how it looks once again as a completed widened line version. So before I go on to the next pattern, I just want to reiterate that there are 3 stages then we're dealing with. We're dealing with the Radii Matrix, we're dealing with the creation of the underlying polygonal tessellation, and we're dealing with the pattern extraction from the tessellation. So it's 1, 2, 3. And that was a rather simple one. These get more and more elaborate, but this next one is more elaborate. This is an example from the Eshrafolu Mosque, which we will be visiting on Thursday. And this is from the mihrab of the mosque. It's a quite outstandingly beautiful example of cut tile mosaic and a beautiful example of a geometric pattern that's got greater complexity. This has 24 pointed stars and 7 pointed stars. So it's got 12 7-pointed stars circulating around each 24 pointed star. So here's a graphic example of the same pattern that I drew. And you can see the overlapping characters on this. So these overlapping characters, when you get familiar with these patterns and categorizing them by family, this clearly is a 2-point pattern. These 2-point patterns will often have these overlapping darts and dart shapes, or kite shapes rather. In this case, kite shapes. So if we look at the left-hand side, this is the polygonal the underlying generative tessellation. The middle panel is showing the 2-point lines on top of the all of the elements, and the panel on the right is is showing the pattern itself after you've dispensed with the underlying network. So once again, it's going to start with the Radii Matrix, and the Radii Matrix here has 24 radii at each corner of the triangle. Yeah. This is especially if you're using software like AutoCAD or any of the design softwares. This is very simple to do. It couldn't be simpler. It's not even very difficult to do with a pencil, with a compass and straight edge. But I don't want to go there right now because it would just take too much time. I'm going to assume that you all understand that this is a rather simple thing to make. Now I've added another set of 24 to make 48 at each vertex of the triangle. Okay, and now look, if I take these two radii and measure their angle, I can see that it's 135 degrees. I can determine what those radii are, the angle of those two radii, 135. And if I then, on the right-hand side, if I look at a heptagon, and I look at the angles of the heptagon, I can see that they're 128.5 approximately degrees. And that can tell me, as a pattern maker, that can tell me, oh, I can fit sevenfold symmetry in that region. It'll require some cheating, but these complex patterns oftentimes you have to do adjustments. They're not like systematic patterns where everything falls into place. These have to be adjusted and finessed. They have to be finessed. So, but these are close enough, 128, 35, that's close enough that I can work with the heptagon in this central area, more or less central area. So now, if I draw a line like that, see that point, if I draw a line through it, and if I then put 14 radii around that line, I'm getting a structure that's in there. You can see that the angles are not quite, on the upper left circle, the angles are close to the radius, but not right on the red radius. The two red radii, the angles of the black lines are really very close, but not quite there. That's okay. It's close enough. It's close enough that, excuse me, it's close enough that I can fit in a heptagon in that area. It doesn't quite marry with the radii. Like I say, we have to finesse this. So now I can take the angles of those I can take those angles of the heptagonal edges, and I can mirror them on the radii of the 24, and I can mirror them, and I can go from this to there just by mirroring. Okay. So now I've mirrored it, and look, I've started to create hexagons. So I can also take, in the same way as I did before, I can draw a pentagon that is tangent to the radii and tangent to the heptagon and the mirrored heptagonal edges. I can put in a little circle in there that's tangent, and that gives me a pentagon. So it also gives me the 24gon. So now, basically, those steps, if I go from this to that, mirroring, creating the proportions of the pentagons and the 24gons, they'll match, then I can apply that and apply it to all three sides, and I have my polygonal matrix. And so there's my underlying generative tessellation. It's actually really quite pretty in its own right. And it actually is using regular heptagons, even though they don't quite fit. The fact that the heptagons are regular means that the hexagons and the surrounding hexagons and pentagons are irregular, but that's okay. So now here's a rectangular repeat showing the triangles. And if you look in the right-hand side, from the difference between these two, do you see I've taken one of the lower heptagons and I've divided the lines of each heptagon into thirds. Actually, I've divided into quarters and only highlighted the two outer division points. So that's the first step, is to divide those. And then into that, you see the difference right in there? I'm connecting the lines and erasing the center, making a little regular seven-pointed star. It goes from there to there. Now I'm putting those stars in the other locations. Excuse me. And now I'm dividing the edges of the hexagons into thirds in the same fashion, and putting connective lines, connecting them, straight line connections. This seems obscure, and it might seem sufficiently unfamiliar that you might think to yourself, this is not something that I could do. But actually, this is not difficult. If you practice this, you get used to it, and it becomes second nature. It's not difficult. It's just a question of knowing what to do. Now I'm dividing the edges of the irregular pentagons. Oh, that's kind of you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'm putting my division points in the pentagons, and then the lines, just connecting them, straight line connections. And that's starting to work really nicely, but it's going to make a really gigantic 24-pointed star. It's like out of proportion, this big open area. So the artist who did the work at the Ishrafulu in the Mirhab put an arbitrary treatment to the 24-pointed star. This is something that's practiced, the use of manipulating or modifying the star forms is something that is practiced widely, especially actually in the Maghreb, in Morocco and in Spain. They had all manner of different conventions for modifying the 8-pointed star, the 12-pointed star, the 16-pointed star, the 24-pointed star. That culture has the most sophisticated way of approaching modifications to the primary star forms, but it was practiced elsewhere, including here in Turkey. And so then when you apply those steps to the entire area, you get something like that. Taking out the underlying generative tessellation leaves us with a pattern, and there's the 2-point pattern. Now, as I said, there are 4 pattern families: the acute, the median, the obtuse, and the 2-point. So this is like one of the most beautiful, to my mind, one of the very most beautiful 2-point patterns anywhere in the Islamic world. It's just outstandingly beautiful. But the same underlying generative tessellation that we went through step by step just a minute ago will also make a really very nice acute pattern. That's the acute pattern. This is, I don't know if this, it says here, I should have taken out. It's not, I didn't change my text. This is non-historical. It says here that it's from the same place, in the same Eshrafulu Mosque, but it's not. That's my mistake, I'm sorry. This is non-traditional, but it has the feeling of a traditional design. It's very acceptable to the tradition. Similarly, this is not known to the historic record. This is the median pattern made from the same grid, also really quite a nice pattern. If you saw this in a mosque somewhere, you wouldn't think, why is that there? You'd think, hey, that's a nice pattern. It's, this is the median, and this is the obtuse. This is my favorite of these 3 non-traditional examples. This is the obtuse pattern. It's really quite a lovely design. So I wanted to show the other patterns that will be generated from the same tessellation, because look how diversely different they feel. These 4 patterns, they really feel very different. And so they deserve to have their own name. So as I said, acute, 2-point, acute, median, and obtuse. So those are the 2 patterns I wanted to show. And before I get into the very last segment, it won't take very long, I just want to mention that the workshop that I'm going to be doing day after tomorrow at the Istanbul Design Center will be focused on one particular non-periodic pattern, which is very, very well known. And there is actually an example at the mosque, at the Fivefold Mosque, of this pattern. And I will be taking the participants to the workshop through, step by step, through the creation of the underlying polygonal generative tessellation, making the tessellation and then making the pattern from the tessellation and then widening the lines from the pattern to create a finished piece. And we have an hour and a half. I think it's enough time, and it will be a good exercise because this is we'll then see when we're in Beshahir, we'll see an actual example of this pattern at the mosque. So it'll be a nice prelude to our visit to the mosque, the workshop. So then lastly, I just want to show that this technique for making patterns I want to emphasize that it's very dynamic and it has tremendous relevance for today because it's possible to make new patterns that have never been made before that are very much in the tradition of Islamic pattern making and very complex in this polygonal technique. And so I want to show you a pattern of my own construction to demonstrate that this has a lot of life to it. This method has a tremendous amount of life to it. I'll be so bold as to say that there are an infinite number of patterns that are undiscovered, waiting to be discovered using non-systematic pattern making methodologies. So here we have on the left the simple hexagonal grid, but I've divided into two different groups of hexagons, the gray and the blue. And I've just indicated 1/3 divisions. Now if I take my hexagons and I change the angles around, if I play with the angles, instead of being 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, I'm putting in angles that are a combination of 3/10, 3/10, and 4/10 in one vertice, and 4/11, 4/11, and 3/11 in another vertice. I'm getting different kind of vertex relationships, but you can see, look at on the right-hand side, look at the red lines. Each of these irregular hexagons is still centered on the triangular grid. So the triangular grid is sacrosanct. It's not going anywhere. Everything in this new tessellation still adheres to the symmetry of the triangular repeat. But I'm changing the hexagonal dual, is what I'm doing. Okay, so then if I move on from there, the left-hand side is the same structure as the right-hand side here. So now we have this, oops, sorry. We have the left-hand side. The faint lines are this new irregular hexagonal grid. Let's call it that, an irregular hexagonal grid. And what I've done is I've taken 10 gons and 11 gons, and I've put them at the vertices of this irregular grid so that they touch. And it just so happens, because this is rather an odd thing, putting 11s and 10s together, putting 11s and 10s together is kind of odd. It's working, but they don't work precisely. The edges don't precisely meet. The center points of the edges precisely meet, but the angles of the edges don't precisely meet. But that's okay, because we can finesse this. So then moving to the right-hand side, I've laid in pattern lines from the median family, and I've used the center points that are overlapping of the polygonal edges that aren't otherwise quite meeting, but the center points are true. So by sticking to the center points, I can get true 11 and 10-fold symmetry going on without any adjustment. And then it just so happens, going back to the image on the left, that in the middle of each irregular hexagon in the irregular hexagonal grid, in the middle, a nonagon, a nine-sided figure just happens to fit. So it's really kind of serendipitous how 9, 10, and 11 all come together with this grid in a rather elegant fashion and make a pattern that you can see here on the right-hand side, make a pattern that's pretty acceptable. This is a, yeah, it's a pretty acceptable pattern. A nicer pattern from this same system is one with an acute pattern that is now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this grid on the right, and I'm going to treat it, I'm going to make a radii matrix like I showed you earlier. Okay, so here's a radii matrix from that same grid of irregular hexagons. And the radii, I've got 9 in the center of the blue hexagons, and I've got 9 in the center of the gray hexagons. Yeah, I've got 9s in the centers of all the hexagons, and then I've got 10s and 11s at the vertices where the blue and gray hexagons meet, 10s and 11s. So I've got my radii matrix. I'm not going to go through it step by step because there's no time, but on the right-hand side, you can see how I've used the radii matrix to develop a underline tessellation of pentagons, barrel hexagons, nonagons, tengons or decagons, and 11gons. So now I've got this now I've got this polygonal tessellation, and from that is I can apply my pattern lines for the acute family and make the example on the right-hand side. And I'll just finish, I think that might be the end. Oh no, not quite. This pattern on the right-hand side with 9 and 10 and 11 pointed stars it feels very, very similar to some of the most complex examples of Seljuk ornament. With one comes to mind, I don't have a photo, I should have included it, with 9, 10, 11, and 12 pointed stars. It's an absolutely beautiful pattern with 9, 10, and 11 pointed stars, 9, 10, 11, and 12 pointed stars. And so this use of consecutive star forms, consecutive numeric star forms, 9, 10, 11, 12, this was a favorite, not all patterns, not all complex patterns do it, but quite a number of them do. And it was one of the reasons I set about with this exercise was to create something with 9, 10, and 11 pointed stars. And so this method of adjusting the hexagonal grid, I just want to show you that there's a lot of there's a lot of other grid systems that can be made in this same way. So the one on the left has 5, 6s, and 7s. The one on the right has 10s, 12s, and 14s. It's consecutive with every other, 10, 12, 14. I've not made patterns from these, but I can tell you just by looking at them that they would make lovely patterns, but I've not done it. This is 8s and one on the left, 8s and 12s. The hexagons have been, the 6 sides of the hexagons on the one on the left have been flattened down to become triangles, but they function in the same fashion. And then the one on the right are 6, 8s, and 10s, again, sequentially every other number, 6, 8, 10. 11, 12, and 13, the one on the left. The one on the right, 7s and 8s. And I'll just say this technique, by the way, of adjusting the hexagonal grid to take into account the angles of higher order polygons like 11, 12s, and 13s. This is not a historic technique. I've never seen an example from the Islamic, of all of the Islamic patterns that I've come across, I've not found one that uses this repetitive strategy. This particular repetitive strategy, and I want to emphasize that because there's still lots of things to be discovered, lots of new territory to find in the realm of making Islamic geometric patterns. Even not just the patterns themselves, but even in the repetitive stratagems for making the patterns. And I think this is the end. So this is the one on the left, 9s and 10s. The one on the right is the same as I already showed you, 9, 10s, and 11s. That's the one pattern, and that's the end. Thank you.